I'm going to start with giving you an introduction about Ideas Beyond Borders, the organization both of us co-founded, and how really the subject of culture wars, domestic and international, has become a challenge for our work globally. So my name is Faisal Saeed al-Mutar. I'm originally from Iraq, from Baghdad. I had to leave the country after ending up on a death list. Part of the reason why I became very inspired about the subject of information and ideas and cultures is that the fact that when I grew up, most of the information was censored. And after the US intervention in 2003, I realized that most of the knowledge about democracy, about human rights, about many of these ideas that people here hold dear, are not available in the local languages. So I started this organization with my dear friend Melissa in 2017. And the whole idea, and it was kind of interesting, where the moment we started this organization, is that we're talking about, people tell us, what do you do? What are the ideas that you translate? And we tell them, Enlightenment, classical liberalism. And one of the same accusations is isn't that white supremacy? So this is where, from the moment we started this organization, the moment we put ourselves out there to the public, the moment the subject of culture wars immediately start intervening in the way we speak and the way we think. Melissa will kind of start this, and then we can talk about what we think are the solutions to move forward. Does that sound good, everyone? Yeah. Awesome. Melissa.
So the structure of the talk would be, I'll make the case that the culture wars aren't the new Cold War, and go into, then we'll go into consequences of how that's going to impact geopolitics and just life in general. And then we'll go into solutions and open it up for Q&A for everybody. So to begin with, there's a lot of unfinished business from the 20th century. And it used to be that there was a certain way of the geopolitical alignment of the time was between the US and the USSR. It was very binary. You were either with us or against us. You were either Warsaw Pact or NATO. This was largely an economic divide. It was two different economic systems. And this was more important than globalization. But then after the Berlin Wall fell and the USSR collapsed, there was a massive change in the world. And you had globalization becoming ascendant again. And countries started to become more economically interdependent. The peace dividend blossomed. And so we were living in the late 90s, early 2000s at this time where it just felt like, yeah, we were really living at the end of history, for all of those who didn't actually read Fukuyama's book properly. And the thing about globalization was that it wasn't just about economic engagement. It was also political, social, and a moral process, right? It integrated, beyond just markets, it integrated worldviews, it integrated ideas and culture. So I really like this quote because a lot of people kind of misread Fukuyama. They forget, they always quote The End of History, but the full title is actually The End of History and the Last Man. And it's a reference to Nietzsche. He writes that the typical citizen of a liberal democracy was a last man who, schooled by the founders of modern liberalism, gave up prideful belief in his or her own superior worth in favor of comfortable self-preservation. Doesn't liberal democracy, he asked, leave unfulfilled certain core aspects of human personality, struggle, danger, risk, and daring? And will leaving these unfulfilled lead to these last men to assert themselves in new and unforeseen ways, even to the point of becoming, once again, first men engaged in bloody prestige battles, this time with modern weapons? And it seems like Fukuyama, it seems like this is actually playing out right before our eyes. What he's foreshadowing is what looks like the culture wars right now, which is replacing the bipolar structure of the Cold War of the 20th century. And to complicate matters, and this point is actually very important, the culture war is happening not just between countries, but actually within countries. And that that is going to have very, very severe consequences. So you see like moral and religious issues such as abortion, gay rights, pornography, multiculturalism. All of this are now just as important as other economic issues as political allegiances. Virginia's governor race was actually last year was fought on the turf of whether CRT should be taught in schools or not. Giorgio Meloni, Italy's new prime minister, weaponizes culture war rhetoric to shore up nationalism. She is a strong defender of family values. She's spoken about gender identity. And then she aims her target also at globalization and the EU, because she believes that traditional culture is actually under assault and that globalization is to blame. And then when BLM protests broke out here in America, it was strange to me to see, in London, BLM protests there against the police when their police doesn't even carry guns. Like, that is strange, right? And Winston Churchill's statue gets torn down and, the pedestal sprayed with the word racist. And so you see all these global, in a way, like America's exporting a lot of these cultural grievances, and it's empowering certain factions that are weakening society from within. In Afghanistan, a lot of the social mores actually surrounding gender and sexuality have evolved so quickly. Like now we're talking about, should we be giving kids puberty blockers, gender-affirming care? We're arguing what is a woman. We're letting Canadian teachers show up with like big titties, like prosthetic tits, right? And no one's, like the Ontario school district doesn't know what to do about that. And it's just as an example, and this is where it impacts IBB's work. In Afghanistan, the US actually spent $787 million on gender programs. One problem is that Pashto and Dari doesn't actually have a word for gender, which is understandable because gender was kind of invented in the 1960s as a distinction from sex, but in the 1960s by a psychiatrist. And so there was a funny clip that was unearthed where you had an expert, like an academic expert, going in Kabul, talking to Afghan men and women. This was in 2015. And talking about conceptual art and Marcel Duchamp's urinal, and asking the people in the audience there, to ponder gender roles in society and things like that. And it was just one of those things which is hilarious, because I think it took, like, we started an Afghanistan translation project. We started translating a lot of material into Pashto and Dari. And it just amazed us that after trillions of dollars of the US spending in Afghanistan, that the Wikipedia page for feminism or women's rights didn't exist. But yet we had experts from the State Department teaching local Afghan women about toxic masculinity and questioning, gender identification. It just, like, we kind of skipped all the way to third wave feminism without realizing, baby steps. And so do you want to talk about the consequences of all of this?
Yeah, and the baby steps, there are a lot of examples of that, and we can see now with both, I would say, the failure of the two wars in Iraq and Afghanistan is not only there is kind of a lack of understanding of the cultures. Like I remember when the US was, I think, in 2006, and many of the people at the State Department and others didn't know the difference between Sunnis and Shias. And that is after spending billions of dollars already getting into that war. And then, there was this recent kind of incident, and that was not the US, it was the United Nations. And they built a school, and then it was meant for girls' schools. And then it is for school who identify as girls. And many people there don't know how to translate that, because that's, so this kind of lack of what Melissa's kind of talking about in terms of expediting or assuming that cultures around the world evolve at the same rates or accept the same values that the US is promoting here at home. And even here, these values are at war with each other. So you have conservative side and the libertarian and the liberal side, and even And what kind of changes from the USSR time is back at the time, there's a lot of theorists, including like Bernard Lewis and others, is that there was a very clear vision of what America stood for and what the West stood for in terms of capitalism as a kind of a main economic system that it stands for, and with religious freedom. And that was what the US used to broadcast into the public through a program called the Voice of America. Voice of America started as a Cold War initiative in which this is what American values are, which is, as I mentioned, capitalism being one of the central pieces of it. And they used to kind of broadcast like what is the line in a supermarket in Moscow and what is the line for a supermarket in Washington, D.C. And they're like, do you see the difference? Which one has a better economic system? Is it this one where there is very little bread, or there's this system in which everybody is prosperous? And that was at the time in which there was kind of, again, a clear idea of what the U.S. stands for. I know like within the libertarian space, there is a lot of opposition to American interventionism of all sorts, but I think most of them might approve of this kind of cultural interventionism in which the U.S. being kind of a world superpower, is that rather than them utilizing weapons to impose their values, rather broadcast the values. And that now have changed. I mean, and the polarization within American politics have really made American policy to be the worst in ages. If you look at the time during the Soviet Cold War, you probably cannot see the difference between a Democrat president and a Republican president about what they think about the Soviet Union. Now you can have greatest example like what U.S. thinks about Iran. You had Democratic administration, a very different policy, and then when Trump came in, he ruined the Iran deal, which I think, in my opinion, was a good idea. But then now they're trying to restore it. So there is no consistent foreign policy. There is very different messaging. Even during the Trump administration with Mike Pompeo and others, America was actually broadcasting all of Christian values, which had a lot of backlash. But so you have this kind of changes between one is trying to promote gender theory and things like that on one hand, and then you get next administration that promotes something completely different. And if you think about it within kind of regions when there is a lot of civil wars, I remember I had a call from a Syrian opposition leader, and he was, I know what Russia stands for. I know what they're going to do. They're going to side with Assad, etc. I know what China stands for. But what does America stand for? And what is America's policy going to be? I know what is going to... And that guy, like, the reason why he was asking the question is that whether he should actually go on a fight, right? Because when you are going on a war, you have to do kind of market research, for lack of a better word, or market analysis to understand who are the big players. And that kind of lack of American identity is now, or lack of American vision, is very strengthened. If you look at a very good example that I always mention about kind of how authoritarian regimes and how outside players do try to kind of exploit this American division, is Al Jazeera. For those of you who don't know, it's a channel mostly headquartered in Qatar, in the Middle East. And they have a completely different kind of English and Arabic facing. So like in Arabic, it's tend to be very ultra-conservative, promoting a lot of very ultra-conservative values, including like supporting a very extremist group called the Muslim Brotherhood inside the region. In English, they're talking about Black Lives Matter and gender stuff, which is in a country that actually has slavery of sort, modern slavery. And yet, in English, they're talking about how America is racist and how the differences between so in a ways that, and that was really their English-facing channel, which was at its main core trying to exploit. On the right faction, there's Russia Today. Russia Today have promoted a lot of actually sometimes libertarian figures in its channels, trying to strike this, because the Russians have realized they can definitely not ruin America militarily, but they can definitely destroy it from within. And one of these ways is that utilizing, unfortunately, sometimes many libertarian figures to promote an anti-American narrative. So in that way, many people will be like, oh, I don't want America to intervene. And that's one of the things, for last talk with Putin, he was talking about like, oh, in America, in Russia, we believe that there is a man and a woman. And part of that reason was he's trying to strike a message. He wasn't talking to Russians. He was mostly trying to talk into American right-wingers that so that way he finds them to be the people who can be joining on his side. So the ways like and Melissa have this theory, and I kind of agree with it, is that there are some people who like Putin here in the US because they think he's a defender of their values more than the president of the United States.
Yeah.
And that has been promoted in actually mainstream channels within the right, is that one of the reasons why there's a popularity among Putin within some right-wing circles is that they think, because now these lines are blurry, what is America, we live in a very globalized world, and that there are some people here who think that Putin, and you can have people in Malaysia or Singapore who think Xi Jinping is their leader, even though they are in a very different country. So we have to be kind of very aware as an organization, also as people, of figuring out a way of how to not be exploited by many of these authoritarian regimes, and at the same time continue to have these important conversations within our cultures about what the solution is.
I will add also that Putin framed this invasion of Ukraine as the denazification of Ukraine. He said that he was purging all the fascists from Kiev. So you see how he uses culture war rhetoric to justify his invasion, and how culture wars become the new lens at which people are looking at geopolitics. And because of this phenomenon where the lines that are drawn in the culture war are both within and between nations, these fissures are exploited by authoritarians so easily, because they have influence in open societies, but open societies don't have influence in their closed societies. And so we have to figure out how to actually solve this problem. And it is a very big problem. I don't think it's a coincidence that, Freedom House tracks authoritarianism around the world. And for, quite a few decades, you see liberal democracy kind of rising. And it's been in the last, 5-6 years that's a sharp decline. And so authoritarians are actually gaining power around the world. And we need to figure out why and how, what to do about it.
And maybe I could do a plug-in for those who are interested. We are hosting, Ideas Beyond Borders hosting or fiscal sponsoring an event in Lithuania, in Vilnius, on November 7th. That is all about bringing people from free societies and activists from closed societies all together to figure out what can free societies do to combat authoritarianism globally. I think we only have 5 minutes left. I apologize because I talked too much. I had Red Bull in the morning, so that's why. But I'm gonna leave it maybe 5 minutes for you guys to ask questions, and maybe we can have a conversation. And also we have a booth at I think the last one. I don't know, maybe because they hate me, they put me there. But I'm there, so if you guys have any questions, we can also have a follow-up conversation. Thank you very much, and we can go to the Q&A. Is there a mic, or maybe you can just shout?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so,
I'm going to call the police if you shout. Just kidding.
I won't. So the topic is that the culture war is the new Cold War. I was wondering, what do you think of the fact that a lot of the culture war stuff that we have today is basically coming from the Cold War era? Because as you might know, in the 50s and the 60s, one of the ways the Soviet Union was kind of projected its soft power, especially in the West, was to sponsor a lot of university professors and a lot of philosophers, like, for example, Jacques Derrida, who was in Russia. It's pretty commonly known that Jacques Derrida was on the Soviet payroll. So, but with the collapse of the Soviet Union, these ideas and the philosophers and the university professors that they sponsored, they haven't kind of disappeared, but continue to go on. So I was wondering, is there a way to kind of mitigate that or fight that when there is no, office or bureau from which all of this is coordinated? So what's the effective way of fighting such a network ideology that's just right in
Actually, that's a good question, and it's a very good point. So, yeah, the Soviets have used this kind of argument about, look at what we did for women's rights, for example, right? To try to whitewash their gulag system, for example, and to score points in the international arena because they know that's what scores points. And the playbook still continues. Ultimately, it was an economic disengagement of two different kinds of economic systems, but there were cultural elements laid on top of it. I think the way that has evolved from that Cold War era now is a little bit different and has interesting implications. But I do agree with what is happening, that these, the philosophical, intellectual bulwark of these ideas are still there. And not only are they still there, they actually have a lot of cultural power in our society. Like they're in our universities, they're in our boardrooms now, they're in corporate trainings, and so it's everywhere. And I mean, I don't know how to fight. We don't have instruments of the state to fight something like that, and that's never really useful in trying to change culture. But one thing that I can think we really need to do. I just had a meeting, I think it was 2 weeks ago, with some Harvard students who started a conservative magazine on campus. They told me that in the Harvard course catalog for this semester, under American history, they were history majors, only one class was not about race. And this was about American history. And if we don't change education, and that includes K-12 because that's where the pipeline starts, I don't think we can fight this. Because it seems like, a lot of this stuff, like decolonized curriculums, a lot of this kind of ideas are not countered in the way that it should be, which is go to school, the right courses, learn actual history. Learn that people of color, his ancestors, my ancestors, have colonized people. Sorry, that's true, right? Yeah.
I'd like to take the credit.
The Mongols sacked Baghdad, like we can be oppressors too. But it seems like very simple ideas like that could easily disabuse one of this kind of intellectual fad that's going on is not done. So I don't know, it has to start with education, or else it's not scalable.
Yeah, I always say is like the best way to combat bad ideas is to make good ideas sexy. And that would be, I guess, the market solution for something like that. And there was, maybe we can end on this. No, that was very interesting. I think it was at the UN, and everybody, like, I think it was the representative of the UN, United States representative. She was the only one who said that the U.S. is a racist country. Yeah. Russia, like when you're at war, let's say, and I think we are at war, and with many of these, not necessarily directly, is that you have one side, you have the Chinese, they're very proud of their culture, proud of their history, and they justify invading many, many places. And then you have Russia, obviously very proud, as we can see. And then you have America as the only country that's so self-critical of itself to the way that is actually kind of embarrassing, is that we need to find a balance talk about these subjects without self-loathing ourselves so much to the way that we can be weak at the global stage.